It was just a lost photo from 1923, but it revealed a mystery that has intrigued photographers. John Allen had spent most of his Saturday mornings for the past 15 years wandering through flea markets and antique shops across Chicago. At 58, he'd made a comfortable living as a freelance photography restoration specialist, and his reputation for bringing damaged historical images back to life had earned him clients from museums, universities, and private collectors across the country. This particular Saturday in late April felt no different from countless others. He'd already visited 3 locations, finding nothing of particular interest. The usual assortment of mass-produced prints, damaged tintypes, and overpriced cabinet cards that dealers mistakenly believed were valuable simply because they were old. The 4th shop was a cramped storefront on the city's south side, wedged between a pawn shop and a closed restaurant. The hand-painted sign above the door read, "Turner's Treasures, Antiques and Curiosities." John had never been inside before, though he'd driven past it dozens of times. A bell chimed as he pushed open the door. The interior was dim, crowded with mismatched furniture, boxes of books, kitchen implements, and the accumulated debris of forgotten lives. An elderly man sat behind a cluttered counter, reading a newspaper through thick glasses. "Help you find something?" the man asked without looking up. "Just browsing," John replied, moving toward a section where framed photographs hung haphazardly on the wall. Most were unremarkable. Studio portraits from the 1940s and 50s, a few family snapshots, several wedding photos with that distinctive post-war aesthetic. Then something caught his eye. Partially hidden behind a garish landscape painting was a photograph in an ornate silver frame, tarnished black with age. John carefully lifted it from its hook and carried it toward the window where natural light could illuminate it properly. The photograph showed a wedding couple, formal and elegant, standing in what appeared to be a church. The image quality was remarkable for its age. Sharp focus, excellent tonal range, professional composition. The bride wore an elaborate white gown with intricate beading, her veil held in place by a delicate crown. She held a bouquet of what looked like roses and lilies. Her expression was serene, almost ethereal. The groom stood beside her in a well-tailored dark suit, his posture straight and proud. His hand rested gently on her waist, in the formal manner of the era. His face showed a slight smile, restrained but genuine. What struck John immediately was the technical quality of the photograph. This wasn't the work of an amateur. The lighting was sophisticated, the composition carefully planned, the development and printing executed with professional skill. He turned the frame over carefully. On the backing, written in faded ink, was a notation, "Marie and Thomas, St. Louis Cathedral, New Orleans, June 16, 1923. John's pulse quickened slightly. New Orleans, 1923, the height of the Jazz Age, the cultural renaissance of the city, a time of profound social change and equally profound resistance to that change. He carried the photograph to the counter. "How much for this?" The elderly man glanced at it without much interest. "Frame's probably worth more than the picture. Silver plate, looks like. $40. John paid without haggling, wrapping the frame carefully in newspaper the shopkeeper provided. As he walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unusual about the photograph, something beyond its technical excellence that he couldn't quite identify. That evening, in his home studio, he would begin to discover exactly what that something was. John's home studio occupied the entire 3rd floor of his brownstone apartment building. The space was equipped with everything he needed for his restoration work: high-resolution scanners, calibrated monitors, specialized lighting equipment, and an extensive library of reference materials on historical photographic processes. He carefully removed the wedding photograph from its tarnished frame, noting that the image had been professionally mounted on heavy archival board. The photograph itself appeared to be a gelatin silver print, common for professional studio work in the 1920s. Under magnification, the image quality was even more impressive than he'd initially observed. The photographer had used sophisticated lighting, probably a combination of natural light from church windows and carefully positioned artificial sources, to create depth and dimension that brought the couple almost to life. John placed the photograph on his scanner, a specialized device capable of capturing images at extremely high resolution. As the scan progressed, he watched the monitor as details invisible to the naked eye began to emerge. The bride's features were delicate, her skin rendered in smooth tones that suggested careful exposure and development. Her eyes gazed slightly away from the camera, giving her an air of quiet contemplation. The groom looked directly at the lens, his expression composed but with a hint of something John couldn't quite name. Pride, perhaps, or defiance, or maybe just the natural tension of someone being photographed. John began his standard technical analysis, examining the photograph for signs of damage, fading, or manipulation. The image was in remarkable condition for its age, minimal fading, no significant tears or creases, well preserved despite being nearly a century old. Then he noticed something unusual. The tonal range in the groom's face seemed inconsistent with the lighting. John zoomed in on the facial features, examining the skin texture with professional scrutiny. He adjusted the contrast and brightness, isolating different tonal ranges. That's when he saw it, subtle variations in the skin texture, barely visible but definitely present. The foundation of the image was slightly different in certain areas, as if the subject's natural skin tone had been carefully obscured. John had restored thousands of historical photographs. He knew the limitations of 1920s photographic technology, understood how different skin tones rendered on orthochromatic film, recognized the signs of retouching and manipulation common in professional portraiture of the era. But this was different. This wasn't simple retouching to smooth blemishes or soften wrinkles. This was systematic, careful alteration of skin tone throughout the entire face and visible hands. He pulled up reference images from his digital library, examples of how different racial characteristics appeared in photographs from the 1920s, particularly those using orthochromatic film stock, which was highly sensitive to certain wavelengths of light and rendered skin tones in characteristic ways. The more he examined the groom's image, the more convinced he became that something had been deliberately concealed. The bone structure, the subtle texture variations, the way light interacted with certain facial planes, all suggested that the groom's actual appearance had been carefully modified, either through makeup before the photograph was taken, through manipulation during the printing process, or most likely through a combination of both. John sat back in his chair, his mind racing. If his analysis was correct, the groom in this 1923 New Orleans wedding photograph was not what he appeared to be. The technical evidence suggested that he was a black man of relatively light complexion who had been photographed in such a way as to appear white. In 1923, New Orleans, such deception would have been necessary for one reason only: to circumvent Louisiana's anti-miscegenation laws that made interracial marriage a criminal offense. The couple in this photograph had committed a crime simply by loving each other. John spent the next several days immersing himself in research about New Orleans in 1923 and the legal and social structures that governed racial classification and marriage in Louisiana during that period. What he discovered was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Louisiana had some of the most rigid and complex racial classification laws in the United States. The state's obsession with racial categorization had produced an elaborate system that classified people not simply as white or colored, but according to precise fractions of African ancestry. Under Louisiana law, anyone with even one drop of African blood could be classified as black, though the actual enforcement of this standard varied depending on social class, economic status, and personal connections. Anti-miscegenation laws had been enacted during Reconstruction and strengthened in the decades that followed. By 1923, marriage between white and black individuals was not only prohibited but criminalized. Violators could face imprisonment, and any children from such unions were considered illegitimate with no legal rights to inheritance or family name. But Louisiana's complex racial history had created an unusual situation. The state had a significant population of mixed-race individuals, many descended from relationships during the French and Spanish colonial periods. These people, often called Creoles of color, occupied an ambiguous social space, and some, particularly those with very light complexions, engaged in what was known as passing, living as white to escape the brutal restrictions and violence of Jim Crow segregation. Passing was dangerous. Discovery could mean loss of employment, social ostracism, violence, or arrest. Families who passed lived in constant fear that some physical characteristic, some slip of speech, some encounter with someone from their past would reveal their secret and destroy everything they'd built. John found records of prosecutions under Louisiana's anti-miscegenation statutes. In 1924, just a year after the wedding photograph was taken, a New Orleans couple had been arrested and imprisoned when an anonymous tip revealed that the husband, who had been living as white, had African ancestry. The wife, who genuinely hadn't known about her husband's background, was publicly humiliated. Their children were removed from white schools. The family was destroyed. The more John researched, the more he understood the courage and the terror that the couple in the photograph must have experienced. Getting married in St. Louis Cathedral, one of the most prominent churches in New Orleans, was an audacious act. It meant maintaining the deception not just privately, but publicly, in front of witnesses, before a priest, creating legal documents that could be scrutinized. The notation on the back of the photograph, Marie and Thomas, provided limited information. These were common names, and without surnames, tracing them through historical records would be nearly impossible. Church marriage records from St. Louis Cathedral in 1923 might still exist, but accessing them would require permission and cooperation from the archdiocese. John also researched the photographic studios operating in New Orleans during that period. There were dozens, ranging from prestigious establishments serving wealthy clients to modest operations working with middle-class families. The technical quality of the wedding photograph suggested a skilled professional, someone with access to good equipment and significant expertise. He examined this photograph again, looking for any identifying marks, a photographer's stamp, a studio name, anything that might provide a lead. There, embossed very faintly in the lower right corner, he found what he was looking for: Beaumont Studio, New Orleans. A quick search revealed that Beaumont Studio had been a respected photography business operating in the French Quarter from 1919 until 1943, when the owner retired. Some of the studio's records had been donated to the New Orleans Public Library's Louisiana Division. John booked a flight to New Orleans for the following week. New Orleans in late spring was already humid, the air thick with the scent of magnolia and the promise of summer storms. John arrived in the early afternoon and checked into a modest hotel in the French Quarter, close to both the library and St. Louis Cathedral. The Louisiana Division of the New Orleans Public Library occupied a climate-controlled room on the second floor, its walls lined with archival boxes and its tables populated by researchers, examining old documents with careful intensity. The librarian, a woman named Patricia Landry, who appeared to be in her 60s, greeted John warmly when he explained his research interest. "Beaumont Studio," she said thoughtfully. "We have some of their business records, though they're not complete. The owner's daughter donated them in the 1970s, but unfortunately a lot was lost over the years. Water damage, deterioration, simple neglect." She led him to a table and brought out 3 archival boxes. These contain ledgers, correspondence, some sample photographs, and miscellaneous business records. You're welcome to examine everything, but please use the cotton gloves and handle the materials carefully. John spent the next 4 hours going through the boxes methodically. The ledgers showed a thriving business: portraits, weddings, commercial photography for local businesses. The entries were meticulous, listing client names, dates, services provided, and payments received. He found the entries for June 1923 and began reading carefully. There were dozens of weddings photographed that month. New Orleans was a popular location for summer ceremonies despite the heat. On June 16th, the date written on the back of his photograph, there were 3 weddings listed. The third entry made his breath catch. Wedding portrait: Thomas Laurent and Marie Devereaux. St. Louis Cathedral, full formal package. Payment, $45. Balance paid. Thomas Laurent and Marie Devereaux. Now he had full names. But there was something else in the entry. A small notation in different ink, apparently added later. Special handling, per client request, extra care with lighting and development. John understood immediately what special handling meant. The photographer had been complicit in the deception, had understood exactly what was needed, and had used his professional skills to help the couple pass. Patricia noticed John's intense focus on the ledger. "Did you find something interesting?" "I found the couple I'm researching," John replied. "Thomas Laurent and Marie Devereaux, married June 16th, 1923. Do you have any other records that might mention them? City directories, census records, anything?" Patricia pulled up the library's database on her computer. "Laurent is a common name in New Orleans, especially among the Creole population. Let me search for Thomas Laurent, born around, let's say 1890 to 1905, to get the right age range for someone marrying in 1923. The search returned multiple results. Patricia narrowed it down by checking the 1920 census records for New Orleans. "Here," she said, turning the monitor so John could see. "Thomas Laurent, born 1898, listed as mulatto in the 1920 census. Occupation, musician, lives in the Treme neighborhood." The Treme neighborhood had been the heart of New Orleans' free black community since before the Civil War. It was also the birthplace of jazz, home to musicians, artists, and a vibrant cultural community. "And Marie Devereaux?" John asked. Patricia searched again. "Marie Devereaux, born 1902, listed as white in the 1920 census. Lives on Esplanade Avenue with her parents. Father is listed as a merchant." John sat back, absorbing the information. Thomas Laurent, a black musician from Treme. Marie Devereaux, a white woman from a merchant-class family. Somehow they had met, fallen in love, and found a way to marry despite laws designed specifically to prevent such unions. The courage that required was almost incomprehensible. St. Louis Cathedral stood as it had for centuries, its distinctive spires dominating Jackson Square. John approached the building with a mixture of reverence and nervousness, carrying a folder with copies of the photograph and the information he'd gathered from the library. The cathedral office was located in a building adjacent to the main church. John explained his research to the receptionist, who directed him to Father Michael Thibodeau, a priest in his 70s who served as the cathedral's unofficial historian. Father Thibodeau received John in a small office crowded with books and files. He was a gentleman with white hair and kind eyes that suggested he'd heard many stories and judged few of them. "You're researching a marriage that took place here in 1923?" Father Thibodeau asked after John explained his visit. "Yes, Thomas Laurent and Marie Devereaux, June 16th, 1923. I have reason to believe there were unusual circumstances surrounding the marriage." Father Thibodeau studied John carefully. "What kind of unusual circumstances?" John decided on honesty. "I believe Thomas Laurent was a black man who was passing as white in order to marry Marie Devereux, who was white. I believe the photographer who took their wedding portrait helped conceal Thomas's racial identity through careful lighting and processing. The priest was quiet for a long moment. That would have been illegal at the time, a violation of Louisiana's anti-miscegenation laws. The marriage would have been void, and both parties could have faced criminal prosecution. I know, but I also believe this photograph represents an act of extraordinary courage and love. I'm trying to understand their story, to find out what happened to them. Father Thibodeau rose and walked to a filing cabinet. Our marriage records from that era are complete. They're also confidential, technically, though after 100 years, I think we can make an exception in the interest of historical understanding. He pulled out a thick ledger and turned pages until he found the entry he was looking for. Here, Laurent and Devereux, June 16th, 1923. Officiated by Father Antoine Rousseau, who died in 1956. Witnesses, Marcel Fontenot and Josephine Dumas. Marriage license number. He read off a series of numbers. Is there anything unusual in the record? John asked. Nothing obvious. The marriage appears to have been conducted in the standard manner, but... Father Thibodeau paused. Father Rousseau kept personal diaries. They're in our archives. I've read some of them while researching cathedral history. He was a thoughtful man, troubled by many of the injustices he witnessed. Would it be possible to see the diary entries from June 1923? Father Thibodeau considered the request. Normally no, but given the historical significance and the fact that all parties involved have been deceased for many years, I think we can make an exception. Wait here. He returned 20 minutes later with a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but still legible. June 1923, he said, opening to the relevant section. Father Rousseau wrote regularly, almost daily. John read the entry dated June 16th, 1923. Today, I performed a marriage ceremony that troubles my conscience, even as it fills my heart with admiration. The couple came to me 3 months ago, requesting that I marry them. The young man is clearly of mixed race, though he presents himself to the world as white. The young woman is genuinely white, from a respectable merchant family, though her parents have disowned her for her choice. They understand the law forbids their union. They understand the dangers, but they also understand something that our laws do not. That love recognizes no color, that the soul knows no race, that God's love extends to all his children, regardless of the divisions humans create. I struggled with this decision.